Part 1. The Ash and the Element. The scent of oxidized lead and melting sand was the only perfume Julian had known for 40 years. His workshop, perched on the jagged cliffs, overlooking the grey expanse of the North Sea, was a graveyard of light. Skeletons of half-finished stained glass windows leaned against the damp cobblestone walls, trapping the weak afternoon sun in fragments of cobalt, emerald, and a deep, bruised violet. Julian worked at the center table, a heavy iron straightedge resting beneath his calloused hand. He held a diamond-tipped glass cutter like a surgeon holds a scalpel. He did not just cut the glass, he listened to it. Every sheet had a tension, a breaking point. He scored a curved line into a sheet of crimson glass. Scratch. The sound was sharp, akin to a match striking in a quiet room. With a gentle tap of his brass knuckles against the underside of the score, the glass cleaved perfectly in two. A keen break, if only life fractured with such precision. The heavy brass knocker on his workshop door sounded, a dull thud that rattled the loose panes in their wooden frames. Julian did not look up. He rarely had visitors, and the few he did entertain were usually lost tourists or local clergymen begging for cheap repairs to their parish windows. The door creaked open, letting in the sharp, salty bite of the ocean wind. "The shop is closed," Julian said, his voice carrying the rough texture of the sea air. Who brushed the dusting of glass shards from his leather apron. "I am not here to browse, Julian." Her voice was smooth, cultured, and entirely out of place in the damp draft of the workshop. Julian finally raised his eyes. Standing in the doorway was a man wrapped in a heavy, charcoal gray overcoat, holding a sleek leather folio. The stranger's face was obscured by the shadows of the doorway, but his posture reeked of money. "I do not take private commissions anymore," Julian said, turning his back to the man to place the crimson shard onto the light box. "My hands are not what they used to be." "They are exactly what they used to be," the stranger replied, stepping into the room. He walked past the racks of antique glass, his leather shoes clicking against the stone floor. He stopped at the edge of Julian's work table and laid the folio down, resting his gloved hand on top of it. "And I am willing to pay handsomely for their memory." Julian frowned. "I'm a restorer, not a conjurer. What do you want?" The man slowly unclasped the folio and slid a single, faded photograph across the dusty table. It stopped inches from Julian's glass cutter. Julian looked down, and the breath left his lungs. The workshop around him seemed to plunge into an icy vacuum. It was a photograph of the rose window of St. Judas, masterpiece of intricate, overlapping circles of fire and gold. It was beautiful. It was perfect. And it was the exact window Julian had smashed to pieces with an iron mallet 32 years ago. "I want you to rebuild it," the stranger said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Every single piece." Julian stared at the photograph, the ghosts of his past suddenly screaming in the silence of the room. He slowly looked up at the stranger. "Who sent you?" Julian asked, his hands trembling for the first time in 4 decades. "How does the atmosphere of a coastal, historical mystery feel to you for this next major upload?" Part 2. The patron's demand. "Who sent you?" Julian repeated, his voice barely rising above the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the cliffs outside. His hands, usually steady enough to trace a hairline fracture in antique silica, betrayed a faint tremor. The stranger did not flinch. He reached into his heavy charcoal overcoat and withdrew a thick, sealed envelope, placing it deliberately beside the photograph. "My employer prefers to remain anonymous," the man said, his tone as polished and impenetrable as obsidian. "He is an avid collector of ecclesiastical antiquities, and he believes that what was lost to the fire at St. Judas must be resurrected." "There was no fire," Julian snapped, the light tasting like ash in his mouth after all these years. The parish records state it was a structural collapse. The window was lost to gravity, not flame. Slow, knowing smile touched the corners of the stranger's mouth, though his eyes remained utterly cold. For course, a tragedy of crumbling masonry. Yet, my employer seems to think that the hands that built the rose window are the only ones capable of correcting that structural collapse. The envelope contains half of your compensation. The sum, I assure you, is more than sufficient to buy your time, your discretion, and your remaining years. Julian stared at the thick manila envelope, then back at the photograph. The image was a cruel mirror. The rose window had been his magnum opus, a kaleidoscope of blood red and gold glass depicting the fall of the angels. It was a piece that should have secured his name in the annals of great European artisans. Instead, he had taken an iron mallet to its center, shattering the faces of the divine into 10,000 jagged, irreparable fragments. "You do not understand," Julian whispered, stepping away from the work table as if the photograph might burn him. "I cannot make it again. The glass, the specific pigments used for the St. Jude's commission, they were sourced from a foundry in Murano, had shut down during the war. The red, the specific, deep Venus red, is impossible to replicate without the original mineral ash. Problem for a lesser craftsman," the stranger replied smoothly, turning toward the heavy oak door. "But not for Julian. You have 6 months. I will return on the 1st of November to arrange transport for the finished panels." "I am not accepting this commission," Julian shouted, his voice cracking, finally echoing through the vaulted rafters of the code workshop. The stranger paused, his hand on the iron latch of the door. He did not turn around. "You will, Julian, because if you do not rebuild the window, my employer will be forced to release the original blueprints to the authorities, along with the diary of Elias Thorne." The blood drained from Julian Seth's. The workshop, the smell of melting sand, the sound of the ocean, everything seemed to fade into a hollow, ringing silence. Elias. The name was a ghost he had drowned in the sea 3 decades ago. Before Julian could form the words to respond, the stranger opened the door, letting the biting wind rush back into the room, and stepped out into the grey afternoon. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Julian entirely alone with the photograph, the envelope, and the ruins of his buried life. Julian stood frozen for a long time. Eventually, his trembling hand reached out and tore open the heavy envelope. It was not just money inside. Wrapped in a bundle of crisp banknotes was a small, velvet pouch. He loosened the drawstrings and tipped the pouch over his palm. Out tumbled a single, jagged shard of crimson glass. It was a piece of the original rose window, and etched into its surface, barely visible to the naked eye, was a single drop of dried, 30-year-old blood. Part 3. Shards of Memory. The crimson shard sat on the light box, a jagged wound against the stellar white fluorescence. Julian stared at it until his eyes watered, until the edges of the glass began to blur and bleed into the surrounding light. 32 years. He had spent 10,000 days trying to wash the smell of copper and smoke from his hands, yet looking at this single piece of silica brought the past crashing back with the force of a tidal wave. He reached out, his fingertips grazing the sharp, unsanded edge. Instantly, the damp chill of the coastal workshop vanished. In its place, the oppressive, suffocating heat of a basement kiln roared to life in his mind. It was the summer of 1994. The air in the city studio was thick enough to chew, heavy with the toxic tang of selenium and cadmium. Julian was in his prime, driven by an arrogance that only the truly gifted possess. But even he was struggling to capture the exact shade of red the bishop had demanded for the robes of the falling angels. "It needs more heat, Julian. It is too flat." It looks like rust. The voice belonged to Elias Thorne. Elias was Julian's apprentice, a boy of 22, with reckless, brilliant hands and eyes that burned with a dangerous ambition. Where Julian respected the chemistry of the glass, Elias wanted to dominate it. He was obsessed with the alchemy of color. If we push the temperature any higher, the crucible will fracture. Elias, younger Julian snapped, wiping sweat from his brow with a soot-stained rag. We lose the batch. We lose a week of work. We stick to the formula. The formula is pedestrian. Elias had argued, his face illuminated by the hellish orange glow of the furnace. Who want the red of divine consequence? Who want blood? You have to feed it gold chloride, Julian. You have to push it past the breaking point. Julian gasped, snatching his hand away from the crimson shard on the lightbox. The memory collapsed, snapping him violently back to the cold, damp present. His breathing was ragged, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He leaned heavily against the workbench. Elias had been right, of course. To get that impossible, deep Venice red, they had pushed the kiln past its limits. They had added the gold. At the cost of their perfect color was a secret Julian had sworn to take to the grave. With a trembling sigh, Julian turned away from the work table. If he was going to survive the next 6 months, if he was going to protect the terrible truth of what really happened to Elias on the night the rose window was completed, he had to begin. He walked to the back of the workshop, past the racks of lead key and soldering irons, to a heavy iron grate set into the floor. It was covered in years of accumulated dust and blast dust. He had not lifted it since the day he arrived on this coast. Straining against the rusted hinges, Julian hauled the grate open, revealing a narrow, pitch-black stairwell descending into the cliffside. The air that wafted up was ancient and stale. He descended the stone steps, the light from his flashlight catching the dust motes dancing in the dark. At the bottom sat a large, iron-bound steamer trunk. Julian knelt before it, pulling a small, tarnished key from a chain hidden beneath his shirt. The lock clicked with a heavy, filer's sound. Julian threw open the lid. Inside, carefully packed in straw, were tightly sealed jars of powdered pigments, heavy metals, and raw silica. And resting on top of it all was a leather-bound journal. Not his, Elias's. Julian picked up the journal, the leather dry and cracking under his thumbs. If the stranger's employer had Elias's diary, then they only had half the story. Because Julian held the other half, he looked down at the jars of raw, dangerous materials. It was time to start the fire again. Part 4. The Crimson Penny. October bled into November with the ruthless efficiency of a changing tide. Inside the workshop, the coastal chill had been entirely banished, replaced by the suffocating, sulphurous inferno of the roaring kiln. Julian had not slept in 3 days. His face was gaunt, his silver hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and grime, his leather apron scorched from flying sparks. He was a man possessed, driven by the ghosts of 1994 and the ticking clock of the stranger's deadline. The rose window was nearly complete. It dominated the far wall of the workshop. An intricate web of lead came, holding hundreds of pieces of meticulously cut glass. It was a staggering, terrifying resurrection. Emeralds, sapphires, and ambers formed the outer rings, pulling the eye relentlessly toward the center. But the center was empty, a jagged, gaping hole, waiting for its heart. Julian stood before the crucible, his heat-shielding visor pulled down over his face. Inside the ceramic belly of the furnace, raw silica and lead oxide were melting into a molten, glowing soup. This was the moment. The alchemy. With trembling, heavily gloved hands, Julian picked up a small vial of gold chloride. This was the secret Elias had unlocked. This was the volatile compound that, when introduced at the absolute apex of the heat, produced the impossible vinous red. And it was the exact compound that had caused the kiln to rupture 32 years ago, showering the basement studio and Elias. In liquid fire, Julian held his breath and tipped the vial. The gold powder vanished into the crucible. The mixture violently hissed, spitting a plume of toxic, violet smoke into the ventilation hood. Julian did not flinch. He grabbed the long iron punty, gathered a glob of the furious, bubbling mass, and transferred it to the marver. He rolled it, shaped it, and pressed it flat. As it cooled, the glowing orange faded, giving way to a deep, agonizing, perfect crimson. "God forgive me," Julian whispered, lifting his visor. He had done it. He had recreated the sin. He spent the next 6 hours cutting, scoring, and grinding the crimson pane until it perfectly matched the void in the center of the window. When he finally soldered the last piece of lead into place, sealing the heart of the rose window, the heavy brass knocker on his door sounded. 3 sharp strikes. It was the 1st of November. Julian did not bother wiping the soot from his face. He picked up his iron glass cutter, gripping it like a weapon, and walked toward the door. He unlatched it and pulled it open, bracing himself against the biting North Sea wind. The stranger in the charcoal overcoat stood on the threshold. "Right on time," Julian croaked, his voice destroyed by smoke and exhaustion. "It is finished. Take it and give me the diary." The stranger did not move to enter. Instead, he took a slow step backward into the damp fog, holding the door open. "I am afraid I cannot give you the diary, Julian," the stranger said smoothly, because the author never relinquished it. From the dense, grey mist behind the stranger, a second figure emerged. He moved with a heavy, mechanical limp, leaning on a dark wooden cane. He wore a high-collared coat, and half of his face was obscured by a tightly wrapped silk scarf. But as he stepped into the dim, flickering light of the workshop, Julian saw the eyes. They were the same burning, relentless eyes from the summer of 1994. "Hello, Julian," Elias said, his voice a harsh, ruined rasp that sounded like crushed glass grinding against stone. "I told you. The formula was not pedestrian." Julian stepped back, the iron cutter slipping from his numb fingers and clattering against the cobblestone floor. The ghost had not drowned. The ghost had returned to collect his masterpiece. Part 5: Refraction. For a long moment, the only sound in the workshop was the distant, relentless crash of the North Sea against the cliffs. Julian stared at the man standing in his doorway. The left side of Elias's face, the side facing the light, was untouched, aged, but handsome. The right side, where the scarf had slipped down, was a map of melted, slicked tissue, a permanent testament to the gold chloride and the ruptured kiln. "You are alive." Julian breathed, the words barely making it past his lips. "The police, the fire brigade, they said no one could have survived that basement. They found remains. They found the remains of the landlord's dog, Julian," Elias replied, his ruined voice devoid of malice, carrying only the weight of time. He stepped fully into the workshop, his cane tapping rhythmically against the stone. "I dragged myself out through the coal chute. I spent 4 years in a burn ward in Vienna, and 30 years waiting for you to find your nerve again." Elias stopped in front of the colossal rose window. The massive pane of glass dominated the room. The lead came holding the terrible, beautiful history of their shared ambition. He reached up with a gloved hand, tracing the air just inches from the deep, venous red center they had nearly died to create. "Why?" Julian asked, his voice breaking. He sank onto his wooden stool, his legs finally giving out. "If you wanted revenge, you could have gone to the police decades ago. You could have ruined me. Why force me to build it again? Elias turned, looking down at his former master. The burning intensity in his eyes softened, replaced by a profound, artistic sorrow. Because, Julian, revenge is pedestrian, Elias said softly. He pulled off his thick leather glove. His hand was a twisted claw of scar tissue, the fingers fused and stiff. I can no longer hold the glass cutter. I can no longer score the silica. The fire took my hands, but it did not take my vision. Alois looked back at the window. I did not want you to suffer. I wanted you to finish what we started. You were too afraid of the heat, Julian. You ran away and buried your talent in this damp tomb. I needed you to remember what greatness costs. As he spoke, the first rays of the pale morning sun crested the horizon. The light hit the North Sea, fractured through the coastal fog, and struck the back of the rose window. The workshop exploded in color. Shattered beams of emerald and sapphire painted the cobblestone floors, while a brilliant, overpowering wash of gold and blood-red bathed the stone walls. It was breathtaking. It was terrible. It was perfect. Julian looked at the crimson light spilling across his own trembling hands. He had carried the guilt of a murderer for 32 years, only to find that he was merely a coward who had abandoned his art. It is yours now, Elias whispered, his face bathed in the red glow of his own sacrifice. He turned and began to walk back toward the heavy oak door. The debt is paid, Julian. The masterpiece is finished, and you get to live with it. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving Julian alone in the blinding, beautiful light. The stranger was gone. The apprentice was gone. But the glass would remain forever. Bonus epilogue: The empty frame. A week later, the coastal workshop was unrecognizable. The colossal rose window was gone, carefully crated in layers of foam and pine by men who spoke in hushed, reverent whispers, paid for by a patron who never showed his face again. They had carried the massive panels out into the freezing November mist, leaving behind nothing but an empty, wooden frame spanning the far wall of the studio. Julian stood before the void. The wind of the North Sea howled through the gaping hole, biting at his face and tearing at the collar of his wool sweater. He did not mind the cold. For the first time in 32 years, the oppressive heat inside his own mind had finally broken. He looked down at his hands. They were scarred, trembling, and stained with the faint, indelible residue of gold chloride and lead. They were the hands of a sinner, yes, but they were also the hands of a master. Julian walked over to the heavy iron grates head into the cobblestone floor. He closed it with a resounding clang, the sound echoing through the empty rafters. From around his neck, he pulled the silver chain holding the tarnished key to the basement trunk. He did not need it anymore. There were no more secrets to lock away. Julian walked out of the workshop, leaving the heavy oak door swinging open in the wind. He stepped to the edge of the jagged cliffs, the grey expanse of the ocean churning hundreds of feet below. With a final, slow exhale, he tossed the key into the abyss. It vanished into the freezing foam, without a sound. When he turned his back on the sea and began the long walk toward town, the storm clouds overhead finally broke. Single, piercing ray of pale winter sunlight hit the empty wooden frame of his workshop, framing nothing but the open sky. It was the most beautiful thing Julian had ever seen.